Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Dr. Martin Farr, a senior lecturer in contemporary British history at Newcastle University. Dr. Farr, thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.
At the end of January, the Department of Justice released over 3 million more documents related to disgraced financier Jeffrey Epstein. And we all know who Jeffrey Epstein was. He was a convicted pedophile who was very well connected to the rich and powerful around the world. But what we're continuing to learn is just how deep those connections really were. And some of the people who were mentioned in the documents have faced questions about the nature of their relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. Others have faced personal or professional consequences, but most have not. But someone whose job has been threatened since the fallout of the Epstein files is someone who has never even met the convicted sex offender, and that person's Prime Minister Keir Starmer. So, to start off the conversation, as we sit here right now, can you talk to us about the moment the Prime Minister finds himself in?
Well, I mean, we're talking about this on Wednesday. Had we been discussing this on Tuesday, we will be thinking about the Prime Minister. Monday, actually. Monday was the key moment when it almost appeared that Jeffrey Epstein could bring down a British government. And as you say, a government, moreover, led by somebody who had nothing to do with Epstein, didn't know about him, wasn't named in the documents. So the reverberations, the oscillations from Epstein have gone on for decades and have affected the royal family and the government. They don't actually affect the government per se. It's really exclusively so far. I mean, more's yet to come out. This is one of the curiosities of this crisis, of this scandal, is that we're awaiting further disclosures, and we're not quite sure when those disclosures will ever end, if they do. And it rates really about the behaviour of someone that Keir Starmer appointed last year to the UK ambassadorship to the United States, which is the most important UK diplomatic post. That Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, his activities with Epstein in the 10, 20 years ago, really. And so it's not a government issue as such, but because he was appointed by Starmer, knowing that he had connections with Epstein, knowing that those connections may have been after Epstein's original conviction, that it cast doubt on the Prime Minister's judgment and the Prime Minister's transparency as to how much he knew and how much he admitted. And that's really what's cut at the heart of government and which precipitated a crisis which the Prime Minister only narrowly avoided being unseated by earlier in the week.
I want to talk about Lord Mandelson because, as you said, the relationship between him and Epstein was previously known, but I think the depth of it was really what was discovered in this latest document dump. And we found that records suggest Epstein gave Mandelson and his partner tens of thousands of dollars. Emails also indicated that Mandelson shared market-sensitive government information with Epstein while he was business secretary almost 20 years ago. And the police have launched a criminal investigation into Mandelson. Keir Starmer fired him back in September. But when we're thinking about this overall, I mean, I am curious because Mandelson is highly regarded as one of the architects of the new Labour Party. So what does this mean for the Labour Party in general?
I mean, I'm used to political scandals and controversies, both in the contemporary sense, but also historically, as a historian of politics. And what the Mandelson scandal is jaw-dropping in its seriousness, in its severity. It is already, in my judgment, the most serious political crisis that's affected any British government, because it brings in aspects which other crises have had, but singularly. You've mentioned the financial implications. Also, in a way, the moral dimension of a member of the cabinet, not merely a member of the cabinet, the Deputy Prime Minister, effectively, Gordon Brown's first Secretary of State, actively undermining the government of which he's part with a foreign power, albeit an allied one, which in wartime could be classed as treason, and encouraging this foreign bankers to actively undermine his colleagues, particularly the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Finance Minister, Alistair Downing. That in itself is utterly extraordinary. And beyond that, we have the much deeper associations that Mandelson had with Epstein than that he admitted. And so Starmer's defence effectively in the past and will be the defence going forward, although a very important caveat is that and he's been forced into this, the government will be releasing much of the documentation to do with Mandelson's appointment as UK ambassador in DC. A committee in the House of Commons called the Intelligence and Security Committee will be determining what can be released and not undermine the public interest or security, reveal security details. So we're awaiting that data dump, as it were, which may be very damaging for the Prime Minister. But his public defence has been, I was lied to, which everyone believes to an extent, because Mandelson's clearly a dishonest person who did not reveal the depths of his relationships with Epstein. But even a cursory research online would have revealed far too many red flags to appoint someone to such an important position. So it was a high risk, high reward appointment from the first place, but no reward could ever have repaid such a risk.
We've been covering the Epstein files as they've been released, and it has really been roiling every American industry, from entertainment to tech to politics and really everything in between. But a point that we always keep coming back to is that it was known who Jeffrey Epstein was, right? Not, it wasn't a secret at all. He was a convicted sex offender since 2008. He pleaded guilty to a sex crime involving a minor. But after that, Mandelson wrote Epstein this note in part, quote, "I think the world of you, and I feel hopeless and furious about what has happened." So, in your opinion, what do you think the worst part of this whole scandal is? The financial implications, the allegations that Mandelson was leaking government information to Epstein, or the moral component to all of this?
I think it's in the eye of the beholder. It depends on who you ask. Each one of the things you mention cuts through to different readerships, different audiences. The fundamental point about dealing with a child sex offender is the one that cuts through to voters, to the public, most of whom don't follow politics or these things very closely at all. Many of whom may not have known that Mandelson was the ambassador in the US, for example, but they know about this. And this cut through dramatically. And it cut through in a way which was very much part of the appeal of Trump and Make America Great in the United States, very much part of the appeal of Brexit in this country, and of Reform UK, which is the insurgent party on the right, which is currently ahead in the polls, and would be a government tomorrow were there an election, which is to be insurgent, to be undermining, to be criticising the swamp, the Beltway, the Westminster Village, this established, complacent, hubristic elite, which ignore the people and conduct their own affairs. Lying and making money as they go. So it's enormously damaging to the establishment in that sense, in terms of the sex offending part. The sex offending part also relates to the Prime Minister's judgment that I mean, one of the papers this morning has said that he was presented with a sheaf of newspaper articles pointing out the ongoing nature of Mandelson's relationship with Epstein and the very real possibility of more being disclosed in the future. And yet he went ahead with the appointment, which I must say is very unlike Keir Starmer, who's an extremely cautious, not to say timid politician. And the one appointment he made, which was really quite spectacular, has been spectacularly unsuccessful in the form of Mandelson. And then the point about the financial malfeasance. In terms of British government, that is really the most damaging of all. There was a scandal in 1912 called the Marconi scandal, when the Chancellor of the Exchequer was involved in shady dealings with the Marconi company. And that is the benchmark of financial scandal in British politics over a century ago. This is much more serious because he's actually receiving money, so is his husband, from a foreign banker, undermining his government at a time of crisis. I mean, Gordon Brown, who was Prime Minister, had a difficult relationship with Mandelson, partly because Mandelson had ensured Tony Blair's ascent as leader in 1994 rather than Brown. But Brown brought him back from being a EU commissioner in Brussels for trade because he was desperate for Mandelson's talents. So the other big issue to all the things we're discussing is that this person resigned twice from office in the 1990s through scandals of various kinds. Yet he kept being brought back because it was felt that his talents were so unique and so beneficial to whoever he happened to be working for. But with those talents came the fact that he himself styled himself the Prince of Darkness. He called his memoir of the New Labour years between 94 and 2007, 2010, The Third Man, which also said he was third after Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, but also alluded to the Third Man movie and the shadows and the dark of post-war Vienna. He liked playing up to this and being networked. And it's these networks and these connections which have brought him down so spectacularly, incinerating his relationship forevermore, but bringing down with him or invoking the fury of Gordon Brown, who appointed him and feels betrayed, and also being perilous for the Prime Minister. The very curious silence is from Tony Blair, who has said not one word publicly since this scandal blew up over 10 days ago.
Why do you think that is? Why do you think Tony Blair hasn't said a word?
I think because he actually has a clean pair of hands in this. I mean, Blair's reputation has been through the ringer since he was Prime Minister, through his associations with some rather disagreeable regimes and the insidious influence of the Tony Blair Institute on the on the present government. So many of the people in government came through Tony Blair's institute. But it seems that he has a clean pair of hands. He hasn't appeared in the documents so far. He did appoint Mandelson. Mandelson resigned twice. He seems to be out of it in that sense. But in a deeper way, Blair embodies so much of what the public was voting against with the Brexit vote in 2016, and what they may well vote against in the by-election in a Manchester seat later this month, where both the Greens on the left and Reform UK on the right are acting as anti-establishment parties. And we have our own midterms. They're not officially midterms, as in the US, but we have a series of elections in May across the UK, Scotland and Wales national elections, and across England, which will be potentially devastating for the government, because all the polls suggest that they can come third or fourth in many parts of the country. And only in 2024, in July, they were elected with an enormous majority. So the change has been remarkable. The febrile, liquid, fluid state of politics is unprecedented. And this adds to the mix. This adds to the sense from the part of the public that we have a continuation of the chaotic government from another party of the Brexit and post-Brexit years.
To your point earlier about Mandelson, it's not like he exactly had this choir boy image before, right? He faced his own set of scandals for years. He's resigned multiple times in the past decades. Prime Minister Starmer appointed him anyway to this huge position, UK ambassador to the US. So Keir Starmer also, this comes at a time when he is facing historically low approval ratings. I was listening to a report, and a BBC reporter had an interview with Starmer at the beginning of the year, and she said something to the effect of, "Is your New Year's resolution to be prime minister by this time next year?" I mean, that's how tenuous his position seemed to be. And he was laughing at the time. He's probably not laughing right now. So how much is this blowback, do you think, from the Epstein fallout on Keir Starmer, do you think is justified? Do you think people say, you know what, this is really because we believe you have poor judgment? And how much of this is really because of everything else going on with his approval ratings and how people aren't very happy with the Labour Party right now?
Yes, it's an interesting question. It's all of those things, actually. I mean, in one sense, one can blame Starmer for the appointment of Mandelson, but equally, other people thought it was a good appointment. I mean, there was a widespread feeling that this is a risky appointment, but I mean, it was basically to have someone in the Trump White House, in the Trump Beltway. And it was felt that what would work with Trump would be a big character who could pick up the phone to the Prime Minister immediately, as of course the President could. So it wouldn't have been appointed under any other president. So one could almost blame Donald Trump for this in terms of the Mandelson dimension, that he requires a different way of doing things than we are used to, hence the appointment. But it also reinforces a broader sense of Starmer as a prime minister and a politician, which essentially is that he's not a politician at all. Now, that, of course, was part of the appeal of Donald Trump not being a professional politician, speaking differently than politicians. Starmer had been chief prosecutor in England and Wales for the left, which helps enormously, being a prosecutor for the left to neutralize the sense of being soft on crime. Didn't work for Kamala Harris, but it was hoped it would work for Starmer. But he was elected in large part because of what he wasn't. The largest party in Britain and America at the moment is the anti-incumbency party. And he was elected because he wasn't the government and because the government was discredited. He was a moderate, conformist, articulate lawyer, no enthusiasm for him, but he won power. But then the wheels started to fall off because of his own contradictions, which was he wasn't a politician. He has no clear set of political values or attitudes, no clear political persona or sense of direction. He was in many ways a creation of someone we haven't mentioned yet, who was the trigger for this week's crisis, really, which was a man called Morgan McSweeney, who was Prime Minister Starmer's chief of staff. And in many ways Starmer was McSweeney's creation, because McSweeney wanted to drag the Labour Party back from where it was 10 years ago in the hands of a left-wing cabal and make it an electable, mainstream, centre-left party. And in so doing, he wanted a candidate to be the front man for this party. And Starmer was the obvious candidate. And so Starmer went through the process, the project, which, unlike New Labour as a project, New Labour was partly, this is the Blair project from 94 right through to 2010. It was to transform the view of Labour, as Clinton did with the Democrats, the New Democrats, from being tax and spend into being pro-growth. So it was electoral in the first instance, but then it had a plan for government once elected in 97, and it carried through that programme quite effectively. The Starmer project was really only about winning power. And to win power, they limited their means of action after acquiring office, in such a way that they were enthralled to events. And Starmer has appeared, and this week has crystallized it, never in command of what's taking place, merely in thrall to it, domestically particularly so. He's been quite effective internationally, and indeed many viewers who know him as an international statesman may be surprised to hear of his reputation, which is the lowest of any prime minister since polling began. A precipitant collapse. Now, a bigger question we might return to is the nature of politics today. Is that any prime minister will very soon be the most unpopular prime minister in history, given the impatience of electors and the increasing cynicism that they have with their leaders, and the way that the press and the media treats those leaders. But as things stand, he's enormously unpopular, and he appears reacting to events rather than leading them. So in many ways, there's a tragic dimension to it, because he is almost the architect of many of the failings that are now evident. And losing McSweeney in the way he did, some see this as an opportunity, others see this as the beginning of the end, because he's lost his brain, to put it crudely.
Let's talk about that a little more. McSweeney, he fell on the sword here a bit, right? He took full responsibility in directing Keir Starmer to appoint Mandelson. Also, then shortly after that, Starmer's director of communications also resigned. What does that do to Starmer's government, A? And B, do you think that because those two are out, that saved Keir Starmer, that helped him see another day, so to speak?
You missed the hat trick. There's a hat trick. He also lost his cabinet secretary, Sir Chris Wormold. The cabinet secretary is the head of the civil service. In the UK, we have a permanent civil service, unlike in the US, so they continue whoever's in government. And Wormold was appointed, and he sits literally next to the Prime Minister in cabinet. And he is the most important administrator, civil servant in the country. And Starmer made the wrong appointment. All the three people we're mentioning now, McSweeney as chief of staff, Allen as head of communications, and Wormold as cabinet secretary, were all the wrong people for those jobs. And the common thread is Starmer appointed them. Why did he appoint them? He appointed McSweeney because he was weak, and because, in fact, McSweeney's predecessor, a woman called Sue Gray, who'd been appointed by Starmer to prepare the party for government, hadn't done so. And so another scandal, another resignation, another embarrassment, and McSweeney's brought in with zero experience of government, avowedly a genius in political communications, in political tactics, in electoral organization, but zero experience of government. And then he brings back Tim Allen, who is the Blair years communications director. It was thought a bit of the Blair stardust could be sprinkled on the government, not unlike bringing Peter Mandelson back. Actually, Mandelson was helping and advising Starmer in opposition before the election. Mandelson had overseen 3 victories for Blair, and then Chris Wormold, who was brought in. There were a range of candidates for cabinet secretary. He or she is a hugely important person because they drive the government's agenda. Parties win power, they become the government, the civil service implements the government's policies. That's the point of it. And Wormold was thought to be a safe choice, stroke an unimaginative choice, stroke a really underwhelming person to be in that office. And once again, and Mandelson is really the exception to this rule. And that's why it's so ironic and so tragic in a sense, historically, as it will be seen for Starmer, that Starmer's usual appointment is someone like Wormold, who would never have frightened the horses or indeed have inspired any great momentum or activity. So he's gone as well. So he's lost 3 of these. Now, as you imply with your question, these could be seen as a new beginning, as a reset. But, historically, when governments start to reset, it's only going one way. The reinvention that takes place. One thing that saved Starmer this week is the experience of the previous period of government of the Conservative Party between 2010 and 2024, and in particular since Brexit in 2016, where they went through prime ministers, they threw out prime ministers in the hope that a new prime minister would be a new front for the public. But the public don't see that. The public see an unelected prime minister in the first place. In our system, we elect parliaments rather than prime ministers. So there's no constitutional issue with a party changing its leader in office and having a new prime minister. But the way the public is increasingly, they will be demanding, I didn't vote for whoever replaces Starmer, there should be an election. Nigel Farage with Reform will be poking this very effectively. The new media we have, the online media, the politically charged media, which wasn't around in Blair's day, would also be saying he's illegitimate, she's illegitimate, there should be an election. That was one reason why Labour MPs reached the precipice and peered over and then backed off in a way the Conservatives hadn't in the Brexit years, the Brexit wars. That saved Starmer, I think. And also the fact, when we talk about prime ministers coming or going. Luck, chance, contingency, timing is hugely important. I can give you any number of examples of where it did or didn't happen because of the timing. And so for Starmer, the three most likely replacements for him were all incapacitated or compromised in some way. They were Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Manchester, whom Starmer had prevented from standing in this by-election in Manchester later this month, the only Labour candidate who could have won, but it would have meant Burnham in Parliament and therefore able to replace the Prime Minister. And Starmer, but for obvious political reasons, didn't want that and precluded his candidacy. So Burnham isn't a candidate. Angela Rayner, who was his former deputy, who's a charismatic woman who speaks to working class voters. She is compromised by her own financial infidelities with a tax issue which is being resolved. And so she is not really able to stand at the moment. And Wes Streeting, finally, who's the most obvious and the keenest to replace the Prime Minister, who himself has been compromised this week by his associations with Peter Mandelson. So although an unlucky Prime Minister in many ways, luck has assisted him in surviving this week.
And as you said earlier in this conversation, if we were having this on Monday, it would be vastly different. Keir Starmer has faced many calls to resign, most notably from the leader of the Scottish Labour Party. He said that this distraction needs to end and the leadership in Downing Street has to change. But dozens of Labour MPs are backing Starmer. Do you think the tide has changed fully or just temporarily? Because you posed this question at the beginning of the week. How much longer can Keir Starmer survive? What's the answer there? Is it a while, or does the head of lettuce need to come out a la Liz Truss?
Yes, it could be either. I mean, he's not at Truss levels of incompetence, of undermining of authority, or faith rather, but he's not far off it. A number of things could happen. I can conceivably see him leading Labour into the election in 2029, which we expect to be in 2029. I can see him Prime Minister after the election, actually, if Labour is returned as the largest single party. It's very important to stress that we are in an entirely uncharted territory in British politics. We have a system of elections which essentially allows for two parties, and the parties alternate. And that's been the case since the First World War. We've never really had other parties which are on a level with the Conservative and the Labour Party, and before the war, the Liberal Party. We now have in England 5 parties, all on similar figures in the teens, and in Scotland and Wales, 6 parties on similar figures in the teens. That means with our first past the post plurality system, one vote sufficient to become an MP for that constituency. Anything could happen. Hundreds of seats, rather than a few, are now marginals. And any conceivable parliament could be predicted, unwisely predicted, because it's so uncertain for the 2029 general election. It's the case that Nigel Farage and Reform UK, however, are so polarising for left, centre-left, liberal, progressive voters, that there may be an effect that they marshal themselves, they vote tactically, they vote against any chance of a reform candidate in their area. And that may assist a kind of loose progressive alliance, we could say, a progressive front, as we had here between the wars, preventing fascism or opposing fascism. Not the Reform UK is fascist, but there's a movement to try and prevent a party that has widespread disapproval from people on the left. So that's a way in which he could still be Prime Minister, not for very long, I suspect, but still after the next election. That being said, it could still be the case that the documents coming out from the Mandelson appointment, more things from the Epstein, from the DOJ, from the Epstein files, the by-election later this month, the May elections, any of these could be a trigger, but only if there's a candidate to replace him. You mentioned Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader. That was a very interesting intervention for very narrow sort of contemporary reasons, but also more structural reasons. Sarwar and Starmer were both very close. And it needs to be understood that Scotland was a Labour fiefdom for most of the 20th century. You could weigh the vote. 50 MPs as a minimum always elected in Scotland. And then we had the 2014 Scottish referendum, which was fairly narrowly won by the Union, by the people opposing Scottish independence. But in the following general election in 2015, a wipeout of Labour. SNP MPs across the country. And SNP has been in power in Scotland, and this is a party committed to Scotland being independent, i.e. the breakup of the UK, in the Scottish Parliament for nearly 30 years. And there was a chance in 2024, when Starmer was elected, of Labour also winning the Holyrood elections, which is the Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh, and Anna Sarwar being First Minister of Scotland. The performance of the Labour government in Westminster has been so bad, however, that the polls in Scotland have transformed themselves, and the SNP are currently ahead and likely to win another term. That's why Sarwar broke with London. It made perfect sense politically because it's all he can do. His last gambit before the May elections is to try and break with London and to put Scotland first, as he sees it, my country, Scotland. That's the big structural reason why it happened. The narrower reason is that we think, and we're reading all reports about this today, that there was an attempt to coordinate this with Starmer's cabinet, that Sarwar would say he was standing down and then cabinet ministers would follow. And that would be fatal for the Prime Minister. What I think happened was we were briefed, I remember vividly, that's almost minute by minute this was going on. We were briefed that he would be speaking and giving a speech. And in that speech, he'd be saying he's breaking with London Labour, calling for the Prime Minister to resign. 2 hours before the speech. Those 2 hours were crucial in Starmer's team in Downing Street, getting on the phones, getting all the cabinet ministers to line up, and their posts on X went out almost with military precision every 30 seconds. And the crisis was averted because I think Sarwar showed his hand a bit too soon. And now, arguably, he's a compromise candidate because what he tried to do had no effect. And the SNP can say this shows the impotence of Scottish Labour vis-a-vis the National Party. So deeper reasons and more specific reasons as to why it didn't work, but why this is not a problem that's going to go away for the Labour Party in Scotland.
Starmer has come out swinging, defending himself to Labour MPs. He said he's never abandoning his country, essentially. There's not a fight he hasn't won. It seems like, as you're saying, he's in a safer spot today than he was just a few days ago. But when you're thinking about the Epstein fallout overall and how it's impacted Starmer and his entire government, how they're almost finding themselves to be a bit of collateral damage, is there any point in history, I know you said this is unprecedented once again, any point in history you can look to and say, this is familiar there, and then look to what happened then to indicate what could happen next?
Oh, I can give you many examples, but that's not wasn't a threat. But to our
Please,
history,
I have all day.
well, I mean, but the trouble is they're all different. I did an interview earlier today, and the interviewer asked about, in political science terms, why does this happen? And of course, I'm not a political scientist, and I would say it's not about science at all. It's about the vagaries of the human condition. It's about circumstance, luck, contingency, timing. All these things go into the melee and the mix, character as well. The decision of one person, as I've mentioned, the weakening, the hobbling of three people at the same time, had this crisis, let me think this through in my head, had the crisis happened a week or so later, and Burnham been given the chance to contest the seat, and Burnham been in Parliament now, or at the end of this month, then I think there'd be no question that there'd be a move to replace Starmer with Andy Burnham. No question at all. But the opportunity came up too soon. Starmer's political hero, insofar as he has one, is a man called Harold Wilson, who was Prime Minister of this country between 64 and 70 and 74 to 76. And Wilson was elected very narrowly and then won a landslide in 66 and was the dominant figure in politics. But he had to devalue the pound in 67 against his will. And devaluation destroyed his premiership and his reputation and his authority. He never recovered, lost the next election. And between 67 and 1970, when he loses the election, there are many attempts to unseat him. And they all fail for different reasons. And this is what's happening with Starmer, because certain candidates weren't right, or they blinked, or they were compromised or distracted, or he made a speech. He made a very famous speech where he tried to address the shenanigans by saying, "I know what's going on. I am going on." And so a well-pitched soundbite, Margaret Thatcher, 1981, you may turn if you want to, the lady's not for turning. A well-pitched soundbite, more than a soundbite, but an aphorism, a statement, a branding of what you're about to the public at a certain moment can restore faith in a leader's MPs. And MPs are really what it boils down to. A Prime Minister is only Prime Minister because he or she can command the confidence of the House. And the confidence of the House of Commons come from having a majority. And so MPs are the key. What's changed since Wilson's day and Thatcher's day is that where Thatcher resigned in 1990, November 1990, forced out by her MPs voted for her replacement. When Wilson resigned in 76 by his own volition, his MPs voted for his replacement. So the MPs in the chamber voted for the new Prime Minister. What we now have, as a mark of the change in politics and the desire for accountability and the desire for democracy, is that were Starmer to stand down or be challenged, his successor will be determined by party members. Liz Truss became Prime Minister. Boris Johnson became Prime Minister because of party members. Liz Truss was elected by a few thousand people who happened to be Conservative Party members, and she was Prime Minister. So I, I'm making a case here for what used to be the case, whereas MPs knew a candidate. MPs would never have elected Liz Truss as leader of the party and Prime Minister in a million years, or Boris Johnson, but the members did. Members are different from MPs. They tend to be much more committed. They tend to be to the Conservative MP members to the right, Labour to the left of most voters. MPs need to be elected. They know what voters think and say. So Starmer's aware that were he to stand down, Labour members would be voting for his replacement. And they're likely to be a more left-wing person than voters would accept. So we've got this new fissure in our politics, which comes from members voting on things. And in that instance, for example, Ed Miliband, who's Energy Secretary, charged with promoting net zero, who was himself Labour leader in 2015 and lost that election, is by far the most popular politician in the cabinet with Labour Party members. Were he to stand, if Starmer fell or retired, he would be Prime Minister, which most observers would regard as highly damaging for the UK economy, for the bond markets, and for Labour's prospects in the next election. So it's extremely complicated, multifaceted, multidimensional, and a good reason for sticking with the Prime Minister rather than risking the uncertainty of change.
To that point, then, my last question for you, I'm going to harken back to that comment that BBC journalist said to Prime Minister Starmer at the beginning of the year, essentially saying, hey, your resolution should be, are you going to be in this seat in a year from now in 2027? I know you don't have a crystal ball. I know you're not a psychic here. A million things could happen. You can't see into the future. However, you are an expert in history, contemporary British history to be precise. So you're the perfect person to ask this. Do you think Keir Starmer will be Prime Minister in a year from now? Do you think he weathers this storm?
My hunch is he will, but not for any reasons which rebound favourably on Starmer. For almost entirely negative reasons, I think he will be, and many of which we've covered, that he's more likely to be in office than not. Also, the case, I mean, the government's been very poorly, it's been quite a hapless government, and it's been constrained by its own timidity. And as we've mentioned, electorally, it can be explained historically why it's been so timid. It can be explained. Labour parties in office, Labour governments, financial crises, and so on. But there is the chance, the possibility with the right chief of staff, the right head of comms, the right cabinet secretary, with a slowly improving economy, which is the case, with the experience of voters of the investment in public infrastructure, which has happened in the health service, in transport, it is possible that the government will recover in the polls. It's worth saying that Harold Wilson, despite the devaluation in '67, Wilson was doing very well in 1970. He just had the election a week late, and he lost the election, but he was actually doing very well. So it can, all drip by drip, almost by osmosis, people can see that there's some stability, but it requires that stability in the first place. And so it requires time to have the right people in office and to see his rivals as well, both within the party and outside the party, falter. Reform UK is the great challenge. Reform UK is, I think, Labour politicians, Labour members fear most is a Reform UK government, which will be far, far worse than any Conservative government in their eyes. A category change in how Britain is governed. It's that serious. And that, I think, will have an enormously disciplining effect on them. Equally, this isn't very helpful for me to contradict myself. Equally, they think the stakes are so high, we can't continue if we're so far behind in the polls. So I think it'll continue in the short term. It depends how the government is viewed in the medium term as to whether he survives. But if I were a betting person, which I'm not, my expectation would be that he will be fronting the Labour campaign in 2029.
Dr. Farr, I really appreciate your expertise here, the conversation, your perspective. Thank you so much for lending the time today. And I hope as we see developments in this, as well as UK politics in general, you can come back on and break them down. Thank you for the time.
My great pleasure.